September 6th, 1997, Westminster Abbey. 2 billion people watched Princess Diana's funeral on television. They saw the Queen bow her head as Diana's coffin passed. They saw Elton John perform Candle in the Wind. They saw William and Harry walk behind their mother's coffin with devastating composure. But what they didn't see was what happened in the brief moment when Queen Elizabeth leaned close to Prince Charles and whispered 7 words that would define their relationship for the rest of her life. Those words were caught on a hidden microphone placed by BBC sound technicians. The recording was immediately classified, but 27 years later, the truth about what the Queen said has finally emerged. The morning of Diana's funeral, Queen Elizabeth stood in her private chamber at Buckingham Palace, adjusting her black hat in the mirror. She had barely slept for a week. The nation was in mourning, not just for Diana, but seemingly for everything the monarchy represented or failed to represent. Her private secretary, Robert Fellows, knocked softly. "Ma'am, the cars are ready." Elizabeth nodded but didn't move. "Robert, in all your years of service, have you ever seen the public turn against us like this?" Robert chose his words carefully. "Not in my lifetime, Mum. The flowers outside the palace, the signs demanding you return from Balmoral, the newspapers calling for abolition of the monarchy. It's unprecedented." "They loved her," Elizabeth said quietly, "more than they've ever loved us, and they blame us for her death." "Mum, the accident was..." "I know what the accident was, Robert, but they believe we drove her to it, that our coldness, our protocol, our failure to protect her pushed her toward desperate escape." Elizabeth turned from the mirror. "And perhaps they're not entirely wrong." The drive to Westminster Abbey was silent. Elizabeth sat across from Prince Philip, both lost in their own thoughts. The crowds lining the funeral route were enormous. Millions of people, many openly weeping. The Queen saw their faces through the car window. Grief, anger, accusation. Inside Westminster Abbey, Elizabeth took her designated seat in the front row. Charles sat to her right, his face a mask of controlled emotion. William and Harry would be arriving shortly after walking behind Diana's coffin in a procession that the Queen had initially opposed. "They're too young," she'd argued. "It's too much to ask." But in the end, the boys had insisted. "Mummy would want us to be brave," William had said. And so they would walk, 15 and 12 years old, with the world watching their grief. What no one in the Abbey knew was that the BBC sound crew, in their effort to capture every moment of this historic funeral, had placed dozens of highly sensitive microphones throughout the building. Their purpose was to pick up the music, the prayers, the sounds of the ceremony, but these microphones were so powerful they could catch whispered conversations from 20 feet away. Senior sound engineer David Morrison sat in the broadcast van outside the Abbey, monitoring audio levels on multiple channels. He'd worked hundreds of royal events, but nothing like this. The entire nation had stopped. The entire world was watching. Any technical failure would be catastrophic. As the funeral began, David monitored the main audio feed, capturing the Archbishop of Canterbury's opening prayers. But he also kept an eye on the auxiliary feeds, the backup microphones placed throughout the Abbey. Channel 7, positioned near the front row, where the royal family sat, was picking up something, breathing, the rustle of fabric, and then very faintly a whispered conversation. David adjusted his headphones and turned up the gain on Channel 7. The Queen was speaking to someone. Her voice was barely audible, but the sophisticated equipment was capturing it. Inside the Abbey, the service proceeded with solemn dignity. Elton John's performance of Candle in the Wind brought many to tears. Diana's brother, Earl Spencer, delivered a eulogy that was barely concealed criticism of the royal family's treatment of Diana. His words rang through the Abbey like accusations. Someone with a natural nobility, who was classless, who proved in the last year that she needed no royal title to continue to generate her particular brand of magic. The implied criticism was clear. Diana had been more royal without a title than those who'd been born to it. The congregation erupted in applause, a shocking breach of funeral protocol. The applause started outside among the crowds watching on screens, then rippled into the abbey itself. It was a public rebuke of the monarchy, happening inside their own sanctuary during a royal funeral. Elizabeth sat rigid, her face revealing nothing. But Charles, sitting beside her, visibly flinched. His jaw tightened. His hands gripped the order of service until his knuckles went white. As the applause died down and the service continued, Elizabeth glanced at her son. Charles was staring straight ahead, but she could see the tension radiating from him, the guilt, the grief, the overwhelming weight of public judgment. The Queen knew what the world was thinking, that Charles had driven Diana to her death through his infidelity and coldness, that his affair with Camilla had destroyed a fairy tale marriage, that he was, in every meaningful way, responsible for the tragedy that had brought them to this abbey. And Elizabeth knew something else, that she had enabled it, that she had chosen to believe palace officials who painted Diana as the problem, that she had maintained her distance when Diana needed support, that she had put protocol ahead of compassion, duty ahead of kindness, institution ahead of the individual. The service moved toward its conclusion. Diana's coffin would soon be carried from the abbey, beginning its journey to her final resting place at Althorpe. As the pallbearers took their positions, there was a moment of relative quiet, just the sound of movement, of fabric, of people preparing for the procession. It was in this moment that Queen Elizabeth did something she almost never did during public ceremonies. She leaned toward Charles and spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the profound quiet of that moment, the microphone on Channel 7 caught every word. "This is your fault, Charles. Remember that." 7 words, delivered with quiet, devastating finality. 7 words that contained decades of disappointment, a week of unprecedented public hostility toward the monarchy, and the Queen's own suppressed guilt redirected toward her son. In the broadcast van, David Morrison's hands froze on the audio board. He'd heard it crystal clear through his headphones. The Queen blaming Prince Charles for Diana's death at her funeral. On a microphone that was recording everything, David's training kicked in immediately. This was not for public broadcast. This was private family conversation caught accidentally on a backup audio channel. He quickly muted Channel 7 and made a note in his log. Auxiliary feed compromised by private conversation, deleted per protocol, but David didn't delete it, not immediately. He knew he should. Protocol demanded it, but this was history. This was the Queen of England at the funeral of the century, telling her son that Diana's death was his fault. This was something that mattered. Inside the abbey, Charles's reaction to his mother's words was visible only to those sitting immediately around him. His breath caught, his shoulders tensed. For just a moment, his careful composure cracked and pure anguish crossed his face. He turned slightly toward his mother, his voice matching her whisper. "You think I don't know that?" The Queen didn't respond. She turned her attention back to the service as if nothing had happened, but those 7 words hung between them, a judgment that would never be rescinded, a wound that would never fully heal. Charles sat through the rest of the funeral in a fog of pain. He'd lost Diana, lost her to an accident that might have been prevented if he'd done things differently, if he'd loved her better, if he'd chosen her over Camilla. And now his own mother had confirmed what he feared most, that it was his fault, that history would blame him, that he would carry this burden for the rest of his life. When the service ended and Diana's coffin was carried from the abbey, Charles walked behind it with his sons, William and Harry on either side of him, united in grief. But Charles felt alone, condemned by his mother's whispered words, judged by a nation, haunted by the ghost of a woman he'd married but never truly loved the way she deserved. In the broadcast van, David Morrison sat staring at the audio recording that should have been deleted. His supervisor, Richard Chen, noticed his hesitation. "David, what's wrong? Did we have technical problems?" David made a split-second decision. Channel 7 picked up some private conversation, family stuff. I'm deleting it now. Richard nodded. Good, last thing we need is private family moments getting out at a time like this. David's finger hovered over the delete button. Then he moved it to save instead. He copied the audio file to a separate secure drive and logged it as technical test file, archive. He told himself he was preserving it for historical purposes, that someday, when everyone involved was gone, historians might want to know what was really said that day. But really, he kept it because those 7 words revealed a truth the public never saw. That behind the careful protocol and composed faces, the royal family was tearing itself apart with blame and guilt and regret. The years that followed Diana's funeral were difficult for Charles. His relationship with his mother became strained in ways it had never been before. Elizabeth treated him with cold formality, as if those 7 words at the funeral had erected a permanent barrier between them. In private conversations with her closest advisors, Elizabeth made her feelings clear. Charles destroyed that girl, she said more than once. He married her knowing he loved Camilla. He broke every vow, every promise, and now we're all paying the price. Charles, for his part, retreated into his work. He threw himself into his charities, his architectural projects, his environmental causes. But those who knew him well saw the change, the weight he carried, the guilt that never lifted. Prince William and Harry noticed the tension between their father and grandmother. William, mature beyond his years, tried to mediate. Granny, Dad is suffering too. He knows he made mistakes. But Elizabeth was unmoved. Knowing you made mistakes doesn't undo them, William. Your father needs to live with the consequences of his choices. It wasn't until 2005, when Charles finally married Camilla, that Elizabeth began to soften. Not because she approved of the marriage, but because she saw that the alternative, keeping Charles and Camilla apart, would only create more misery. And Elizabeth had learned from Diana's death that sometimes protocol and duty caused more harm than they prevented. But even as their relationship improved, those 7 words remained between them. This is your fault, Charles. A verdict delivered at the moment of greatest public scrutiny, never taken back, never apologised for. In 2015, a strange thing happened. David Morrison, the BBC sound engineer, now retired and in his 70s, had a crisis of conscience. He'd kept the audio recording of the Queen's whispered words for 18 years, hidden on a secure drive in his home, but he'd never forgotten it, never stopped wondering if he should reveal it or destroy it. He reached out to a royal historian, Dr. Margaret Ashford, whom he'd worked with on several documentaries. They met at a quiet cafe in London. Dr. Ashford, I need advice about something I recorded in 1997, something that was never meant to be public. Margaret listened as David explained what he'd captured on that hidden microphone, the Queen's 7 words to Charles. The judgment, the blame, the family rupture playing out in a whispered conversation at Diana's funeral. That's extraordinary, Margaret said carefully. But David, you know you can't release this while they're alive. It would be a violation of their privacy. I know, but should it exist at all? Should I destroy it? Or should I preserve it for history? Margaret thought for a long moment. History benefits from truth, even painful truth. But timing matters. If you preserve it, make sure it's sealed until long after everyone involved has passed. Let it be a record for future historians, not a weapon used against living people. David nodded. That made sense. He created a sealed archive file with instructions that it not be opened until 2050, more than 50 years after the funeral. Long enough that everyone involved would be gone. Long enough that it would be history, not scandal. But then Queen Elizabeth died in September 2022. And as archivists began the enormous task of sorting through decades of royal records, someone found something unexpected. Elizabeth's own diary entry from September 6, 1997, the day of Diana's funeral. The entry was brief but devastating in its honesty. Diana's funeral today, hardest duty I've ever performed. The nation blames us, and they're right to. We failed her. I failed her, told Charles at the Abbey that this is his fault. Cruel words at a cruel time, but true. He destroyed that girl, and I let him. We're both guilty, but only one of us will be remembered as the villain. Perhaps that's not fair, perhaps it is. Too tired to know anymore. When this diary entry was discovered and eventually made public, as all royal diaries eventually are decades after death, it confirmed what some had long suspected, that the royal family's composure at Diana's funeral had masked intense guilt and blame. The revelation prompted David Morrison, now 80 years old, to come forward with his own story. He revealed the existence of the audio recording, the 7 words the Queen had whispered to Charles, and his decision to preserve it for history. I kept it because it was truth, David explained in a televised interview. Behind all the ceremony and protocol, there were real people struggling with grief and guilt. The Queen blamed Charles. Charles blamed himself. And Diana was gone, beyond all blame or forgiveness. The audio was never released publicly, respecting David's original intention to seal it until 2050, but its existence became part of the historical record. Confirmation that the perfect composure shown at Diana's funeral had been exactly that, a performance. Underneath were family members tearing each other apart with recrimination. Prince William, now the Prince of Wales himself, and in his 40s, was asked about the revelation during a charity event. My grandmother loved my mother in her own way, William said carefully, but she was also Queen, raised in a different era, bound by different expectations. She struggled to balance those two roles. The whispered words at the funeral, if they were said, came from a place of pain. Everyone was in pain that day. And your father? A journalist asked. My father has spent the last 26 years trying to honour my mother's memory through his work, through his support of my brother and me, through his efforts to make the monarchy more compassionate and connected to people's real lives. He carries guilt. We all do. But he's also human and he's trying. Harry, in a separate interview, was more direct. Look, my family fucked up where my mother was concerned. Full stop. My father made terrible choices. My grandmother enabled them. The institution protected itself instead of protecting her. But what good does blame do now? Mum is gone. We can't bring her back. All we can do is try to be better. Try to make sure no one else is destroyed by protocol and duty and fear of change. The 7 words Queen Elizabeth whispered to Charles at Diana's funeral, "This is your fault, Charles, remember that," became a symbol of the complex, painful dynamics within the royal family. A reminder that behind the crowns and ceremonies were people struggling with very human failures. For Charles, who eventually became King Charles III after Elizabeth's death, those words remained a weight he carried. Even decades later, in private moments with his sons, he would reference them. "Your grandmother was right, you know," Charles said to William during a private conversation at Balmoral in 2023. "It was my fault. I married your mother when I loved Camilla. I tried to make it work, but I failed. And she paid the price." William, gentle but firm, replied, "Dad, we've all paid prices. Mum paid the highest one, but you can't carry this guilt forever. Mum wouldn't want that. She'd want you to be happy. She'd want you to be a good king. Focus on that." But Charles knew, and William knew, and Harry knew that those 7 words would be part of their family history forever. A moment of brutal honesty delivered in a whispered judgment at the worst possible time. The Queen blaming her son for the death that had nearly destroyed the monarchy. In the end, the hidden microphone at Diana's funeral captured more than just sound. It captured truth. The raw, painful, complicated truth of a family trying to maintain composure while falling apart internally. A queen struggling to balance duty with maternal disappointment. A son crushed by guilt he could never fully escape. The words Elizabeth whispered to Charles weren't just about Diana's death. They were about decades of poor choices, institutional failures, and the human cost of putting protocol before people. They were a verdict delivered by a mother to her son that would define their relationship for the rest of Elizabeth's life, and they were a reminder that even in the most carefully choreographed public moments, the truth has a way of slipping through. Sometimes caught on a hidden microphone, sometimes revealed in a private diary, sometimes simply visible in the anguish on a man's face as he walks behind the coffin of the woman he failed to love properly when he had the chance. Diana's funeral ended. The cameras stopped rolling. The world moved on. But for Charles, those 7 words remained. This is your fault, Charles. Remember that. And he did remember every single day for the rest of his life.